to the fourth of 5 sessions that make up Martian Encounters, Imagining Alternate Non-Colonial Futures. In this series of international conversations, we're exploring the possibilities of more inclusive and reflective futures through interdisciplinary dialogue. My name is Joey Eschrich. I'm the managing editor at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. And I'm also there the assistant director of Future Tense, a partnership of ASU and New America. And I'll be your host for just this session. And I'm beaming in today from Arizona State University's office in Washington, DC. Amid rapidly escalating climate chaos and social uncertainty, this project of imagining non-colonial alternatives feels more essential than ever. We need to reevaluate our connections, focusing less perhaps on the relentless pursuit of economic gain and more on sharing and supporting one another in the search for new ways to inhabit this world and worlds beyond. And so through our conversations about borders, temples, and ecosystems yesterday, and now in Maps, we're considering a series of imaginative and intellectual frameworks that might help us to navigate these challenging times. We think of borders, temples, ecosystems, and maps as a potent quartet of keywords, ones that different people will imbue with richly disparate definitions, but ones that can also hopefully serve as common points of reference as we go on to imagine a broad array of possible futures. Later today, we hope you'll stick with us at 4 p.m. Central Mexico time, 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll conclude with a final panel that we call Martian Weirdness, or Allo Marciano. And in that panel, we'll reflect on what it means to imagine existence beyond Earth and the challenge of conceiving of a truly inclusive future. So before I go any further, just a little more here, I want to take a moment just to thank everyone involved in producing Martian Encounters. I'll tell you more about our wonderful panelists here in a second, but I want to thank Livia Brenda, Alejandra Espino, Marcela Chow, and Mia Armstrong-Lopez, as well as my colleagues at ASU, Future Tense, El Cúmulo de Teslo, MarsArchive.org, the ACT program from the Institute of Astronomy, the Palacio de la Autonomía, and Fundación UNAM. It's like a huge coalition of people to put on this series of events, but it's been really thrilling to work with all these folks and get to know them. I'd also like to thank our interpreters for our sessions yesterday and today, Aurea and Elise, whose work is making this bilingual event possible and allowing everyone to express themselves in the language in which they feel most comfortable. We're quite grateful for that. So we're here to talk about maps, and I will probably end up saying quite a lot, but I won't say too much up front. But just to set the stage, today we'll consider how maps can catalyze our imagination and help us reshape and rethink the rules and assumptions that we've adopted to form our senses of reality. But at the same time, maps have also been and continue to be powerful tools for imposing a sense of reality by force. Maps can be used to limit the terms of our vision and of our knowledge. They're often tools of conquest and exploitation. So we'll be talking about how maps operate in both of these ways simultaneously all the time. And we'll consider whether and how we can use maps for liberation and solidarity to help us create more just and verdant futures. So I am here to introduce our 2 panelists now. So I'll start by introducing Mito Reyes. Mito, hi. Mito is a writer, editor, and researcher. He's a member of the Colectivo Mixe. He holds a master's degree in Mexican literature from the University of Guadalajara and a PhD in Hispanic literature from El Colegio de San Luis AC. He has published essays, short stories, and chronicles in magazines and anthologies. He's also written several research articles and coordinated and edited both academic and community publications. He is co-founder and editor of Revista Catástrofe, a quarterly publication focused on literature and society, and he is part of the Seminario Internacional de Literaturas y Oralidades. So sorry for my pronunciation. Mito, where are you calling in from, if you don't mind telling us?
Sí, hola. Mije, mi pueblo es Mije, de la Ciudad de México. De hecho, estoy en la UNAM atendiendo otro compromiso y las personas aquí muy generosas me prestaron una oficina que en realidad no sé de quién es, pero sí, yo estoy en la UNAM, en la Ciudad de México. Un gusto platicar con ustedes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So two travelers. So we'll get to that in a second. But Randy Smith is our other wonderful panelist who's here today. He is a veteran video game designer and creative director with more than 27 years of experience. He's best known for his work on the Thief series and as the co-founder of the award-winning indie studio Tiger Style. His work pushes the boundaries of narrative-driven, non-violent gameplay, offering innovative experiences that blend storytelling with player agency. His game Waking Mars takes place in the year 2097 and guides the player to explore caves under the surface of Mars to awaken a dormant, highly interactive ecosystem of alien plants and animals. Randy's also a scholar of interactive art and culture. He's published a monthly column in the magazine Edge and is a frequent speaker at the Game Developers Conference. Welcome, Randy. Do you mind telling us where you're located right now?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here. Today, I'm in Lubbock, Texas, making my way back to Austin, Texas, where I live half the year. And yeah, thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you. So we also have a third speaker for this session, Grace L. Dillon, who is an incredible academic author and editor, but it seems like she is having some trouble making it to us. So if she joins us part of the way through, then I will take a moment and I will pause and introduce Grace. I hope you all get to hear from her. But yes, so we will begin this conversation and we will keep our fingers crossed. So I want to start by just having each of you talk a bit about an actual map. So the provocation I gave to these folks is just to ask, what is a map that has affected you or changed the way you think? Tell us about how you encountered this map, how it catalyzed your imagination, how you felt like it opened up possibilities for you or helped you to understand something new or in a new way. So Mito, why don't we start with you and your map? And I think we're going to get to actually see these maps as well.
No sé si se está viendo ahí.
We can, yeah.
Ok, miren, yo pensé en un par de mapas, o digo, ojalá que llegue Brenda, ¿no? Pero a lo mejor me dé tiempo de... El primer mapa que yo quería como comentar tenía que ver más con una experiencia entrañable y tal vez ñoña, porque es el mapa que venía en una edición de Planeta, de Agostini o Minotauro, no recuerdo, del Señor de los Anillos, que hacia el final del libro tenía pues una hoja plegable que mostraba toda la Tierra Media, ¿no? Desde Eriador, Mordor y todo eso. Y la recuerdo mucho no porque haya sido el primer mapa, ¿no? Sino porque sí fue como en mi primera juventud, como la primera experiencia que tuve de ir haciendo una lectura e ir al mapa, hacer los recorridos con los dedos y todo esto. Después fue muy significativo para nosotros porque acabó deshojándose, porque después de mí lo leyeron mis hermanos y ahí tengo la versión. Era una que en el lomo tenía la comunidad del anillo y se formaba completa si los formabas juntos. Ese es como el primer mapa que yo pienso que despertó mi interés literario y además lo leí joven, entonces no me percaté como de la cuestión racista y de los orcos relacionados con Asia, ¿no? Entonces prefiero no volver para mantener ese recuerdo. Y el otro mapa que estoy compartiendo, que creo que se ve, ¿verdad? Es un mapa que conocí hace mucho menos tiempo. Este mapa lo, lo hizo un compañero mío del colectivo Mixe, se llama Julio César Gallardo, y a quien le mando un saludo desde Marte o desde Ciudad de México. Es una versión hecha para un libro. Esta no es la versión que yo conocí, esta es una versión que salió para un libro que recién se editó en la editorial que formamos con los compañeros de mi colectivo, que se llama Nanoki, em, y que nos muestra algo que la inmensa mayoría de los mijes no sabemos, que es como todo el territorio que a la llegada de los españoles formaban los pueblos mijes zoques. Eh, en la parte verde tenemos, la parte más verde se encuentra lo- la- como a lo que el Estado mexicano, bueno, la colonia y el Estado mexicano nos hizo el favor de reducir nuestros territorios. Entonces pensamos, incluso no sabemos del parentesco entre mijes y zoques, y me refiero como a la gran mayoría de los mijes. Nosotros hasta el día de hoy no recibimos educación pública ni en Ayeo, bueno, en Ayeo, que es Mije, pues, ni de historia, ni de contenidos nuestros, ¿no? Entonces nosotros nos vemos en la necesidad de producir nuestros propios materiales. Entonces este mapa, mucho antes de que yo dialogara con los compañeros de mi colectivo, pues fue una explosión en mi cabeza verme el tamaño de la civilización del pueblo, y de la tradición de la que yo venía, la relación con el pueblo olmeca, y además eh, descubrir en ese mismo sentido, yo crecí pensando que no habíamos escrito, porque eso se nos dijo siempre, que el Mije se escribió hasta el siglo XVIII con caracteres latinos, ¿no? Y en este mismo descubrimiento de este mapa, pues el descubrimiento es que los pueblos mijezoques inventaron la escritura en Mesoamérica y que el mijezoque, más allá de la tradición mayense, es la escritura logográfica, silabográfica, perdón, que se escribió primero en Mesoamérica y que tiene 2000 años escribiéndose. Entonces, descubrir esta relación y este mapa viene con todo ese contenido de descubrimiento. Y solo un apunte ahí, esperemos que llegue Grace. Nomás menciono un tercer mapa, no lo voy a describir, tal vez un poco para platicar con Randy. Yo jugué el Thief, este, no sé si, y después jugué Splinter Cell, no sé si tenía que ver, pero bueno, descubrí el gran mapa que a mí me marcó en ese camino es el mapa vivo de Red Dead Redemption, ¿no? Que para mí la litera- los videojuegos hace rato que alcanzaron lo cinemático, pero en mi opinión de aficionado, obviamente, en Red Dead alcanzaron lo literario, ¿no? Y bueno, ahí está, ahí lo dejaré.
Mito, thank you so much for sharing that and your memory of the Tolkien map. I love the idea of a map that you don't want to return to or a text you don't want to return to because you need to leave that memory intact because things do change when you go back to them. I've had that experience many times. Randy, do you want to take it away and show us the map that you've brought?
I would be pleased to. Um, so this is a map from a video game called Ultima 4. And this video game is very old. It's from maybe 1985 or earlier. And I played this game as a young person and loved it very much. And the map is a big part of what makes this game special and the experience of the game special. So there's many things I wanted to point out about this map. One is this game is so old, it was when you would buy a game in a box and you would have a physical disc. And this particular developer of a game would put other objects in the box besides just the disc for the game. So this game would come with like spell books, like little tomes where you could read about the spells you could cast, a coin that was meant to be a coin from this imaginary world. And then it came with this map, and the map was cloth. So it wasn't just a piece of paper that could rip. It was an actual piece of cloth. And it felt these artifacts, made you feel more and more like you were part of the world. So it was a very big part and a special part of the experience of playing this game is to hold this map and to think about where you were. A lot of video games like a modern game Diablo is all about moving from room to room of the dungeon and making sure you kill every monster and take all the treasure, and that's most of what there is in the game is fighting and looting. And there's obviously some real colonial parallels there that are not good. In this game, Ultima 4 was different. There was a lot of things you could do. You could visit cities and talk to people. You could explore the wilderness and discover mysteries. So it was less that way. You were not just trying to kill everything and steal all the loot. And because of that, this map is very fun for exploring. So this up here is like a desert area. And there's this big lake here, and so in your imagination you're like, what's it going to be like when I finally get to that part of the world, and is there some sort of secret in the lake? And the answer is yes, of course there is. And these like little icons here that show phases of the moon are called moon gates, where you could walk into this magical door and appear in a different one that corresponds to what phase of the moon it is today. And so you might wind up at this moon gate, and then you're stuck on this little island, and you have to wait till the moon comes back out to leave, unless you can find a boat or a raft. This is, a mountain range, and you would either have to go around it, or eventually, if you get clever enough, you can figure out how to find the pass and go through for a shortcut. And so it was a very great way to, as a player, a way to tell a story about like different opportunities, different possibilities to evoke your imagination. So it was very powerful for those reasons. Has other fun secrets too, like there's secret islands underneath this crest. So lots of things to explore and discover. There's this writing on here is also comes with the game, and to this day I can still read it. This says Britannia Bay. This says the Isle of Deeds. I don't remember going there. I don't know what's there, but I can still read the language, 30 plus years later. Another interesting thing about this map, and this is true for many video games, if you got in your boat and sailed off the edge of the map to the east, you would just reappear in the same spot on the west. And same thing with north and south. If you go off on the north, you appear on the south. And so the east-west thing, if you imagine what that means in terms of the shape of this world, it means that you could put this map on like a cylinder, like a paper towel roll, and that's the shape. But then because of the north and south, you take that paper towel roll and you connect it around, and that's the shape of a donut, or a toroid is the official term. And it's very often the case in video games that our worlds are donut shaped, are toroids, for that reason, because of the way you wrap around. So yeah, I love this map very much. I held it in my hands, and I've always been very fascinated by maps of all types. This one's obviously based on European medieval historical maps. It's got a little of the Here Be Dragons kind of vibe, where people didn't know what was off the edge of the map. And it was it was a big part of what it meant for me to become a game designer. It was a big inspiration as trying to create experiences like this one. And it's also interesting, I think I will get to talk about later, the difference between being a player and a designer of a game, and how you approach the maps differently. So my job as a designer is to make maps based on the work I've created that evokes these same kinds of imagination and feelings for my players.
Thank you so much, Randy, for that. That's I love the detail about the toroid map, and it actually makes me think of many video game maps. I won't start naming a bunch of games where you just hit an invisible wall at the end of the world, and I actually really don't like that. So I appreciate the contiguity of that, and of course the physical maps. That's, I think, one thing that's easy to miss. I remember the first time I got to go to the map library when I was in college at Arizona State as a student, and I had so much fun and couldn't believe such a thing existed. But just getting to like lay out all these maps on this beautiful different kinds of paper, and even some stuff on like linen and things like that. It's a really magical thing. Okay, so I want to kind of open up from there. Oh, I should say, by the way, and this is in chat too. We have a plenty of time here to do a Q&A session, and so if you all have comments or especially questions for Randy or Mito, or I guess me, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will keep an eye on that as we go through the conversation, and we'll address your questions. And if it's a simple question, one of my colleagues might write a response to you real quick if it's about a resource or something. But yeah, we would love to hear from you and hear your experiences and queries. So please share those in Q&A, and there's just a button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Yeah, so I want to dive right into what I set up at the beginning, which is to say maps have this. I've been thinking of them as this, Janus-faced like thing where they function to kind of open up our imagination and invite us in the way that I think to some extent both of you shared, especially about games. But they also have this, and we've already started talking in these terms of they're used to extend power and domination in various ways to somehow wield knowledge as a sort of weapon, or to flatten a complex reality into something that's legible in, say, 2 dimensions in many cases. So I wanted to hear what you two thought about that kind of like dynamic or dialectic of maps as having this kind of invitational imagination expanding capacity, but then also having perhaps the capacity to limit our imagination or to colonize our imagination. How can maps do one or both of those things in your experiences or in your professional lives and artistic lives?
Do you want to go first, Mito? I feel like you're the bigger expert on this subject.
No soy experto, pero pues sí, yo creo que los mapas son representaciones, ¿no? Y por supuesto que no digo algo nuevo, pero pues son analogías de aquello que representan y como tal, pues son sujetos de ambas cosas. Por una parte de incentivar la creación incluso artística. Yo recuerdo los mapas medievales, pues, que eran pues obras de arte, ¿no? Los hacían pintores, de hecho. De hecho, creo que les decían pintores de mapas. Y también de manipulación en el buen sentido de poder tocarlos, ¿no? De agarrarlos. Yo recuerdo mucho un globo terráqueo de una de mis tías, que lo que más me gustaba era el relieve, la especie de orografía que tenía. Y recuerdo mucho la sensación de frustración de que todo el azul fuera plano, que era casi todo el globo terráqueo, ¿no? Como no mojarte las manos, como en este intento de representación real. Y en ese sentido, pues creo que los mapas son experiencias tanto de creación como de interpretación, más allá de los conocimientos cartográficos, ¿no? Las escalas o los conocimientos físicos, la medición de, sí, de las distancias con los distintos sistemas. Pues es fundamental que haya un espíritu creativo durante la creación de los mapas. Y hablo de cualquier mapa, ¿no? O sea, también pensando, y ahorita tal vez podamos ir para allá, en los mapas como discursos, como metáforas, ¿no? Como analogías. Mm, Yo creo que una de las partes centrales de la elaboración de los mapas es la relación con lo desconocido. Y en ese sentido, cuando reducimos los mapas a la cartografía, pues vamos a esto que menciona Joy, ¿no? Incluso hablar de descubrimiento, pues es una noción bastante colonizadora, ¿no? Es como la carrera por llegar primero y casi siempre a un lugar que en realidad ya tenía gente ahí o a las nociones de espacio vacío, no necesariamente habitadas por seres humanos y ni siquiera por seres físicos, pues, ¿no? Sino otro tipo de entidades que responden a verdades no científicas. Entonces yo pensaría que sí está el lado de la imaginación, pero que si lo reducimos a la cartografía, no vamos a poder nunca desligarlo de la empresa colonizadora que inventó América. Y por eso a mí me parecía muy sugerente la invitación de ustedes, a imaginar cómo podrían ser mapas no coloniales. eh, Muy rápido desde mi disciplina, que son los estudios literales, pero más desde mi adscripción a la nación Mije. Yo diría que los mapas, además de esta abstracción, son relatos y muchas de las preguntas suelen decirte cómo hacer nuevos mapas, ¿no? Que no sean coloniales. Yo diría que adelante hay que experimentar, pero no necesitan ser nuevos. Hay cientos de años haciéndose otros mapas. Nada más requeriría de escarbarle un poquito, de estar dispuestos a dialogar con otras tradiciones. Yo pienso en los relatos tradicionales de mi pueblo y muchos de ellos se tienen que contar caminando porque dan cuenta del territorio. Entonces te van a ir diciendo y van a concluir diciendo, y por eso este lugar se llama de esta manera. Y no tendría mucho sentido contarlo fuera de su relación estrecha y de los pies sobre el territorio, pues, ¿no? Incluso el territorio como idea, vamos, o sea, no por la migración vamos a dejar de poder tener estos relatos. Em, y estos mapas pues reflejan muchísimo más relaciones que distancias o sea, relaciones entre el espacio y el ser humano. En mi pueblo, por ejemplo, la palabra que ocupamos, yo soy de Totontepec, eh, la palabra que ocupamos para decir comunidad o poblado o población, lo que ustedes quieran, como el espacio físico, a lo que ustedes le llamarían, no sé, Texas, Washington, y nosotros le llamamos, o sea, en vez de decir ciudad o pueblo, le decimos, Nashka, que es, en realidad es, pues tierra, pueblo, una cosa así, en uno solo. Y entonces cuando las autoridades le hablan a la gente, le hablan como a un tú, porque el nosotros es un tú, y le van a decir, ustedes, comunidad, lo que sea, ¿no? Y yo pensaría que ahí hay como una beta muy interesante para recorrer metáforas no coloniales y que está bien, ¿no? O sea, seguir en la idea de los estadios de avance que nos pueden dar muchas cosas, pero también hay otras cosas que no requieren ni de llegar primero, ni de la velocidad, ni de descubrimientos científicos, ni de aparatos tecnológicos de mayor potencia. Eso diría por ahora.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Mito. I think it did make me think of I love your point about the notion that things are empty or void until they're mapped. And, that reminds me of a kind of, if you think of cartography as a historical pursuit, and especially in with European colonialist roots, it's sort of there's a cartographical imaginary, and the cartographical imaginary says if Europeans haven't been there yet, it doesn't exist. It's void and formless. We give it form using the map, and then we can communicate that back. And the other thing that you said that I loved is the idea of maps as relation, which I would love to continue to pursue that, throughout our conversation, but also the notion that if you're walking a space, it often feels very different than the map. And I moved to the DC area shortly after the kind of lockdown period and the pandemic, and so I hadn't been here in several years, and hadn't ever lived here. I mean, I'd only been here for a couple days at a time, and so I was coming into terra incognita in a way. But I knew where everything was on maps. But when I started walking around, it was like, oh, this looks really close, but is actually really far. Or like, you wouldn't walk this way. Like, I remember there was like a cool gallery or something near my apartment, and I was like, oh, I want to go there. It's really close. There's like a freeway in between it, a huge highway. I couldn't get there. I had to go around. And so it was actually a really long walk. It took like a whole afternoon, and it looked like it was next door. So just even in the most mundane, everyday way, I think like that notion of the map as a kind of metaphor for a space that like gives us certain literacies with the space, but then leaves out just like so much information about the lived experience of traversal, is really important, and actually connects us even back to Randy's map with like modes of traversal and proximity and video game maps. And in games, as you open up different ways of getting around, or as Randy said, looking for different kind of shortcuts or pathways or secret entrances, that can totally rewrite the map for you or open up new spaces and new ways of getting from point A to point B. So thank you so much. There was so much to think about there. Randy?
Yeah, I'll try to follow up on that. That was great. I mean, I'm actually a student of maps. I have multiple books about especially historical maps. Also fascinated by like, for example, National Geographic thematic maps, which are sort of like infographics that merge lots of information. And as Mito was talking, I was thinking about some historical colonial era maps, like a minor difference, but important difference between two types. One would be the colonists are mapping out North or South America, and they just show the terrain, the mountains, the rivers, the western shore. And the message there is like, this is all ours. We just haven't gotten there yet. And the slight difference is the ones where they would actually show the indigenous nations that were already there with their names. And it's a very tiny difference, but it's at least this little bit of acknowledgement, like, oh, there actually are people who live here. You know, we're not the first. And it's only a small difference because it still shows that their intention was to take that land anyway, and the people be damned. But I guess to me that shows, and I think this is very obvious, but there's so many small decisions that go into making a map, and each one of them is a judgment and a filter to promote a certain view of reality. You know, so one interesting example from history is that today the top of a map is usually north, but centuries ago the standard was that the top was east, and that's actually where the word Orient comes from, as in the Oriental, or the Eastern Orient, is because east is how you orient a map. That's the correct way to look at a map. And so that's one decision that changed over the years, and north became correct. Obviously, whatever, how you frame up a map, what's in the center, what's on the sides, there's an interesting view of the globe that just looks like a water planet. Like you can see very little land, and that's just the Pacific Ocean being in the center. And because we bias human habitations, that's a very rare view of the Earth, but it's an equally valid view of the Earth. So what things are included, what things are omitted, what the scale is. So many decisions go into a map, and all of them inform a worldview that you're pushing, whether you intend to or not, you're pushing a worldview. It's a little bit to me like editing a film. There's no way to edit a film without making judgments, that this is your decision about what this film should be. And same thing with a map. As you make a map, you're telling other people this is the reality of the world. So those are the ways in which I think they sort of craft and limit imagination and push a particular view. I mean, on the other side, it's not like this is perfect or anything, but I do find maps can really unleash that imagination and help you think about the real worlds and what it would be like to be in these places in a way that creates empathy or cultural connection. So one of my favorite ways to use Google Maps, especially when like Google Earth first came out, is I would just spin the globe around and just stop at some place, and I'm like, oh, I'm in Uzbekistan, and I'd like zoom in until I was in this small village, and think about like, there are people here who just walk down the street every day. That's their life, and their life is so different than mine, but it's very real. And just try to imagine that, or go into northern Russia and look at these gigantic open pit mines and be like, you could stand there and look at this open pit mine. That's reality, and you're like only you're so far above the Arctic Circle. It's just so different than my world. And it gave me this very quick and instant access to this limited way to imagine other existences. So maps just they really run the gamut of human experience in terms of they can be extremely limiting, they can be very eye-opening, I think.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. That's a great point about Google Earth. I watched this PBS, this is probably older, but this PBS clip I found online recently about these people who play this game online where they are shown a single still image from Google Earth, and they have to guess where that is on the globe. And there are some people who are remarkably good at it, who can like pinpoint within a few square miles, where something is, and they learn all these literacies with these images, and basically understanding not just the images, but actually like I think in some sense it's a literacy with Google Maps and the kinds of information that you can include in those fairly low res images. And so they're looking at street signs, and they're looking at the topography, and they're looking at the types of cars is often a really strong tip off, and housing, like what the roofs on the houses look like. And it's really impressive. They can sometimes be like, it'll be like a guy from the United States, and he'll be like, oh, this is obviously like Western Uzbekistan, and he can do it in like 10 seconds just by looking at the image. It's really wild, but it gives you a sense that like spending so much time with that map gives them a totally new way of looking at the world and kind of parsing reality, which can be so powerful. I actually want to shift to a slightly different question that I prepared the two of you for, but I think you'll be fine, which is a little bit about creative practice and maps. So I'm going to ask you to lead us off on this one, Randy, but Mito, I have a version of this question for you, which is, Randy, like when you're designing games, I know many games you've designed involve actually designing maps and then the player having to use those maps to complete those maps, or use the map to orienteer or track progress in various ways. And so I'm sure that's an incredibly decision-intensive process, and maps are such an important part of the experience design for a game in some ways, and the information economy. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about, maybe using an example or two, like, how one goes about understanding how to create maps de novo for games, and based on geographies or territories that, like, are imaginary in some sense, and are
Yeah.
fabricated or sort of built up.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate map I showed, I think, is a pretty standard way to do it. Here, I'll share it again, so we can talk about it. So this is more classic game design, but as I mentioned, it shows you places, and as a gamer, your logic is like, oh, well, I have to either take a boat to get to this island or this moon gate, and there's this village here, but there's something else up here, and therefore it must be more interesting or important. It's like a further, more difficult exploration. Or you can just kind of like use your knowledge of how games work to realize like, oh, this is the swamp, so there's going to be something interesting hidden in the swamp, but I have to be prepared for it or whatever. So the designers already knew that was the case, and they used the map as a tool to get the players to head in the right directions. Just like you might talk to somebody in a village and they would tell you the legend of the wise person who lives in the swamp that you should try to go talk to. So that's another way to give the same type of information. So that's sort of a classic way. I wonder if I can switch. I'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Sorry, I'm switching.
Oh, I put you on the spot in some sense. So
No, it's all good.
Great.
I was ready. Guess what? This is the map from my game Waking Mars that I and my team created together. And it has some of those same qualities, where if you look around this map, like this is a map of a cave system as seen in cross section. So it's different than a top-down map. But this is obviously something interesting, like a reservoir. You can kind of see some water down here. There's some kind of interesting structure here. Something interesting is going on in this green part. And so as a player, you can use that same logic to be like, oh, I want to try to get to these places. Must be something is going on there. But there was more that we did, and actually we didn't do that in this particular game because the map would get revealed as you moved through it. And I do think there's some logic to that, which is potentially harmful, that Mito touched on, which is like, oh, nothing exists until I arrive, which is false. And even though there are not any human beings in this game, I also agree with Mito that things that are not human beings have equal validity and should be acknowledged as well, and they exist before you get there. So there's some problematic stuff. However, there's more we're trying to do in this map. And this is a buried piece of logic in the game. It wasn't important to know this to play the game, but it was important to me as a designer to explain how it could be the case that there were a dormant ecosystem in the caves of Mars. Like, what is the astronomical phenomenon that caused that to happen? And so we actually created an entire planetary backstory for the planet of Mars that involved a time when there was, previously there was life on the planet. And so this stratified rock that we see through most of the left of the image is from that time period. And then there was the period of heavy bombardments. And then there's another layer, which, geophysical layer, the darker one that shows the evidence that happened. And then the top layer is the lava. And actually the first cave you go into is a lava tube. So there's these enormous volcanoes on Mars, and our fiction was that their lava covered the entire planet and left these caves, which you would use to access and ultimately wind up in these much older caves from a previous era. So we wanted to be consistent with the story we were telling, and so the map helps to show that logic. I think I've got another one here. Can you see this map now? Did I change maps?
Yes,
Okay,
beautiful.
great. That was the right way to do it. And this is a map from our game Spider, where you actually play a spider who goes around an abandoned mansion and makes webs to trap insects. And so it seems like a simple puzzle game, but then as you move through the mansion, you learn the fate of the people who live there. Like there's actually a dramatic story that took place in this mansion, and you leave the place covered in cobwebs, sort of as the last step for it being abandoned until some future person comes along and discovers it. This is from the second version of the game. The first version didn't have a map. I like the idea of maps, but it was a very simple game, so we did not do that. The second one is a much bigger game, so you're an even more hard to believe spider at this point, but you're going across this entire estate. And I think this one is more similar to the ultimate experience of, you would see the ship and you'd be like, I want to go on that ship. There's probably some really good bugs to go. I can go up in the rigging and eat the bugs up there, and you would be correct. Um, and also, this map is the thing that's interesting about this map is it's from a perspective, and this is actually a type of map that was created in the 19th century pretty frequently. So instead of just seeing a top-down sort of like abstract interpretation of where different buildings and streets are and other terrain features, you would actually see sort of a picture of them in perspective, like we see here. And in the 1800s, they didn't have drones or helicopters or typically a way to get that perspective. Occasionally, there would be a tall hill and they would climb up the tall hill and the view down on the city was good enough and they would just draw that. But usually they had to imagine it, which I think is very interesting. Yeah. Is that a good answer to your questions, Joey?
I think that's a fantastic answer. No, I think it's great to hear about the thought process of creating those maps. And yeah, it's making me think of all of the different ways that you end up using maps in games. And of course, like edge cases where there's a game called Atrian Odyssey where you have to draw your own maps of the dungeons that you're traversing within the game. And like, so you're exerting some actual authorship over the environment with that. But then, in so many, I also love the idea of the map that's almost anachronistic, like you said, and that requires, and the way that maps can provide a point of view that we don't otherwise have. I hadn't thought about that it was actually hard to get a top-down view on a landscape, but that the map could emulate that experience in some way or simulate that experience, I guess is what I mean, in a way that like most people would never have access to, unless they had, like you said, a very tall peak nearby or something. So that idea of the map, and perhaps this is a more appreciative mode that we can get into about maps as we continue to try to be critical about them, is that, they can give us a different perspective on an environment, a broader perspective, perhaps on an environment that we otherwise feel like we're familiar with or that we feel very close to in some way. It can give us a different information layer, I guess, in a way. And games often are playing with that are giving you different information layers or layering together information about factions in the game or different species or different kinds of topography, like that maps are kind of like not just telling you whether to hit up, down, left, or right, but actually also telling you kind of who and what is in a space, or like your Waking Mars map kind of tantalizing you and saying, well, okay, there's this like anomaly here. So, okay, what is, it's sort of like, this looks differently textured and colored. So I should go check out what's creating that effect. So that's that sense of maps as invitations, I guess, as well. Mito, you started us off, and this is what got me to formulate the question this way, by talking about Tolkien and a book that is famous for having like a great map, right? And I know you're a scholar of literature, but also of language and the preservation of languages. I was wondering what you thought about the creative choice to include maps in books. In some way, I feel like some authors really like to include maps or feel that they need to include maps in the same way that some people feel like they need a list of characters, dramatis personae, at the beginning of a book, or a glossary for a book that has a lot of neologisms and jargon in it. And so I think in some sense a map can sometimes be like, well, this book's really hard to follow, so you're going to need to refer to this map all the time. But then in other books, I feel like maps are perhaps used differently to orient us or to invite us into the world, or to have us compare the fictional world of the novel, for example, to some experiences we've had. So I was just wondering, as a scholar of literatures, what you thought about the kind of creative space of kind of pairing maps, cartography with text in some way.
Sí, ahorita que mencionaba Randy lo del mapa orientado hacia el este, ahorita que eran europeos, porque luego pensamos que toda la tradición cartográfica ignora Asia, ¿no? En algún momento vi un mapa asiático volteado, como que el norte era como el África subsahariana, supongo que por la relación musulmana. Entonces, bueno, no sé, ese que mencionó. A mí me gusta, yo creo que hay como en la literatura, o al menos en la crítica literaria, hay un cierto, bueno, en la tradición que yo conozco, ¿no? Que es mayormente hispánica y latinoamericana, mexicana, ¿no? Hay como cierto desdén por la asistencia a la letra, ¿no? O sea, como que la letra se sostiene por sí misma. Entiendo que por ahí va la postura. Entonces, la relación mapa-texto, estoy pensándolo ahorita, ¿eh? No, 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 creo que se reduce como a ciertos espacios. Uno de ellos es al didáctico, a los libros de texto, las historias de texto, los relatos tradicionales, pero orientados pues en programas escolares, ¿no? Y por otro lado, a la literatura fantástica, mucho a la épica, pues, pero a cualquier fantástica. Yo en algún momento fui lector de estos autores de Dragon Lance, era joven, pues, y había un ciclo que se llamaba el ciclo de la puerta de la muerte, y la cartografía ahí eran mundos, se dividía el mundo, ¿no? Entonces a mí me parecía que asistía muy bien a la lectura. A mí me gusta, vamos, pero entiendo que puede ser subestimado. En el caso de Tolkien, creo que lo que te asiste a la lectura, y más en el Silmarillion que en el Señor de los Anillos, son las genealogías, que son muchísimos personajes y te pierdes, ¿no? Y hay gente que abandona.
Mhm.
A mí me encanta, a mí me gusta muchísimo. Pero ahí hay gente que deja de darle sentido cuando ya va en la octava generación. Y entonces a mí el hecho de ir en el texto e ir al mapa final, a mí me gustó mucho esa experiencia. Y esos libritos que les mencionaba, los tengo ahí, aunque están todos deshojados. Y finalmente, igual pensando, creo que cuando se reduce el valor, en este sentido, de los relatos tradicionales a su valor didáctico, se pierde mucho de la complejidad. Y pienso pues que, por ejemplo, cuando yo decía que son recorridos, no quisiera como entrar en la dinámica de partir sus valoraciones, sino no pueden entenderse estos recorridos sin la ética que están intentando mostrar, sin los regaños que nos están dando, ¿no? Esto un poquito como muletilla a lo que dije con anterioridad. No sé si más o menos respondo a la pregunta.
No, I think it was a tough question because you probably aren't drawing maps for the things you're writing, but in the same way that Randy kind of has to generate maps. I was thinking too, Mito, of like some of what you were saying was making me think of like about the relation between text and image and the types of stories that kind of call for maps. That like when everybody reads Dante's Inferno now, today, we all see images with it. It's almost always printed with engravings and illustrations. But of course, like I don't think the original editions had those. Those are all added later. And that's such a geographical story. It's all about traversing a space, and it's about mapping that space and understanding the relation of each layer of hell in that case to the others and the people who are there. And it just strikes me that so much of I think our understanding of that novel as contemporary readers many hundreds of years later is like based on the images and maps that are presented alongside it. Or it's not a novel, it's a narrative poem, but that narrative that you almost would have had to create the map in your head when you were originally reading it if you were a contemporary reader. Yeah, and the other, I think it might be, isn't it 100 Years of Solitude that is a novel that is highly multi-generational, and it's like if you don't understand the family tree, then you can't understand the story. And that idea that you said of like genealogy as a map that's often necessary for a novel, was super interesting to me because I do think often, not just in Tolkien, the relationships among characters and the familial geography becomes really important. So I don't know. I found that super interesting in your response, and for some reason it ended up making me think of Dante and how hard I think it probably would have been to parse a story like that without the map. It's like, but Dante wasn't a cartographer, and perhaps for historical reasons wouldn't have been drawing a map to go with his poem. It would have been a very odd thing to do at that point for a writer. Randy, did you want to add?
Yeah, if anyone has a more modern example would be that TV show House of the Dragon, which is
Mm.
just very much based on this family lineage. And I'm always like, and many people have the same name, like the grandfather and the son have the same name, and I always lose track. I would love to have a map of the genealogy to understand what's going on in that show.
Mhm. So I want to shift us. Oh, Mito, please go ahead. Love to hear more.
Sí, yo pienso pues entonces, si le entendí, la tradición entre imagen y texto es de larga data y en muchas tradiciones. Yo pensaría, por ejemplo, en los libros mesoamericanos. La tira de la peregrinación es la historia de un recorrido. La Odisea es eso, pues, es las vueltas que estuvo dando. En el caso de la tira de la peregrinación, por ejemplo, que narra la venida de Aztlán hacia el Valle de México, mucha gente, muchos historiadores, pues dedican cierto tiempo a dilucidar dónde queda Aztlán, porque son textos que tenían sentido en su circuito cultural. A lo mejor no era ni siquiera importante o a lo mejor ellos ya sabían. Entonces el mapa no necesitaba decir geográficamente aquí está, porque a lo mejor estaba intentando decir otras cosas mientras se narraba, ¿no? Y eso pensaría yo. Ahora,
Ujú.
textos cuya gestación, por la mención pues de 100 años de soledad, ahorita se está viendo la adaptación de Netflix de Pedro Páramo, ¿no? También diría que por otro lado hay textos que no les hacemos mucho bien intentando traducirlos, ¿no? Porque también son ejercicios medio condescendientes en algunas ocasiones. A lo mejor en la complejidad, yo pienso en las novelas barrocas, pues, y en las
Mm.
producciones de selecciones, ¿no? De Reader's Digest, que parten un poco de la idea de que el lector necesita asistencia para construir estos mapas que en realidad todo el tiempo estás construyendo cuando haces la lectura. Yo por mi parte no vería en ningún momento Pedro Páramo, no sé si sea bueno o malo, pero temería mucho que me robe las imágenes que yo tengo en mi cabeza, la voz que yo escucho, más allá de que sea yo un buen o mal lector, es parte de la experiencia de la lectura.
Yeah, it strikes me that going back to my own Dante example, it's like actually the imaginative exercise that the poet is putting you through could be argued to be very much undercut by having the map that visualizes everything for you. Because I mean, in that book is so visceral about describing all kinds of torment and mayhem, and so once that's all drawn out on a map, it changes your relationship to the text in some way. And I again, like your motif in this conversation, Mito, is the idea that of I think a certain type of way of colonizing imagination that if you go back to something or if you have this support, this visual support, it might actually replace or I liked your phrase, or at least in the interpretation, steal, that it might steal the images out of your head and or, vitiate your experience in some ways. And Randy, it reminds me of some ways that people talk about maps in some games that, if the game is too well mapped, then in some ways it can discourage free floating exploration. And people use the map as a kind of like menu almost to say, okay, well, like I know exactly how to get here. And so like, I'll just go here next. The map becomes a to-do list in a way versus like, for example, the Ultima map, which is clearly more of an invitation. It's on cloth, you have to kind of be constantly funneling between it in the game. I wonder if that resonates for you, that idea of like,
Yeah.
how useful you want to make the map in a way as to the readers or users of a text.
Yeah, I mean, there's a design decision about how much information to put in the map, and how additional information gets added to the map. So if I like the Ultima map as the model because you can tell you're going to pass through some woods and there's going to be a river and there's a bridge, but it's not quite where you want it to be. So you have to make this decision. Do I ford the river, go off my route for the bridge? And then there's going to be some hills. And then finally I can get to this village I wanted to visit. There's a story you're telling. But all those details are omitted, like what it's actually going to be like to cross that bridge, and is there a troll who lives underneath, and what's, oh, there's actually a different village I encounter in these hills. And so if all that information was there, if it's like troll under the bridge, this other village with this other person to talk to, you wouldn't even need to go. Like, you don't need to have the experience yourself. You would just read the map. So having a certain amount of vagueness is really important. Oh, and yeah, and the other thing about adding information to the map, some games do, have a very vague map or no map, and as you move through it, you're mapping it out. And actually, as I mentioned, Waking Mars does this to a degree. And there are some, I think that can be problematic, not just because it says this thing doesn't exist until you get there, but it also has this feeling of completionism. There's a thing that players like to do. They want to finish every task that's possible. And a map like that will trigger that urge. And then the players are having basically their behavior that has been incentivized is for them to conquer the entire world, basically, like leave no corner untouched, and they must go to every place. And the Ultima map doesn't do that. It shows you the whole world. And there, if you don't want to ever visit this place, you don't have to. It's really driven by what interests you, what part of and again, Ultima is a cultural game, what part of the culture you want to pursue and are interested in.
So we've got a bunch of questions from folks listening in. I want to ask one more of my questions first, selfishly, but then we'll shift there. So I want to get to the heart of the matter in some sense, and complete the circle, or whatever metaphor you like, which is it possible to create radical maps? And I think we've been talking around this a bit. Do we need different kinds of maps? Do we need better maps? If we want to encourage critical thinking, if we want to think about pushing back against colonizing forces, reallocating power and control. Is there a tradition or a type of map, and this might just bring us back to things we've already talked about, that we could draw on, or do we need something totally new? And, as we move into a more complicated world with possible, additional escalating activity in space, as we move towards an escalating climate crisis, as we move towards more migration, demographic change, more conflict, perhaps. What kinds of maps do we need, and is it possible to use maps to push back against power in ways that are constructive? And I wonder what each of you would think about that.
I'll go first because I think Mito's answer will be better. It was a mistake to go second last time. When I see a map that challenges some of the default ways maps are constructed, so when up is not north, there's a rotation, there's a framing. It often, it's like on your internet TV, where the Apple one will kind of show you a view of the globe, and you're trying to be like, oh, is that the coast of Africa? Where is that? And it has that same phenomenon where this is a map that's showing, mountain ranges. And then eventually I realized, like, oh, that's a mountain range that's going through Mexico, or, through Chile or something like that. Eventually, what happens is I realize that the mountains are older and more permanent than the invisible imaginary lines that we humans draw on the Earth and pretend that they're really there, the borders of nations and so forth. And it does, I think, shake up my perspective. And a lot of maps can do that, where you realize, you rethink some of the things that you hold as assumptions. I think a little bit about maps that, those, as I mentioned, thematic maps that show us things like, migration routes of animals, or, natural resources, or they can show you over time how parts of the globe are being reforested. They shake up that maps are only for navigation, mastering space, declaring ownership of space. So I do think maps are never agnostic. They always have a value system. They always push a belief system, but they can be used to push back on some of the more damaging ways that we tend to think about the world. And then I would also challenge this idea that maps are that to the extent maps are for mastering a space, that is necessarily always bad. I think to have a map is to have humility, right? There's the joke, at least in America, that men never use maps because they always think they know where they are. And to realize that you have, to have a map is to say, like, oh, I don't know where I am, and I'm going to need some help navigating around here. So I do think maps can do as much good as bad. And it's a great question, like what is the future of maps and how can we use them to do more good than bad?
Yeah, thanks for that, Randy. It does make me think, the first maps that you see if you're just like a, studious little kid like I was, is political maps and maps about wars and territory conquest. And that just even the first time, I don't have a clear memory of this, but when you start seeing maps that aren't political maps, that just don't have those national borders, and you start to see the like contiguity between geographical features and bodies of water and things like that, like you start to say, oh, these are just lines that people have drawn, right? And just starting to historicize and contextualize what those lines look like. Because when you first see the maps, those lines are really reified. They're literally like thick black marks that write over the landscape. So that, I think that was a wonderful answer. I'm glad you went first. Mito, what do you think? Radical maps? What do we need for maps? Future of maps?
Sí, yo intentaría responderlo como en dos momentos, ¿no? Primero decir que una de las trampas más simples, pero más poderosas del discurso de la modernidad, más allá de si hay o no posmodernidad y todas esas cosas, es pensar que no hay opciones o que ciertas discusiones son universales, pues, ¿no? Por ejemplo, yo, que en mi tesis doctoral tuve que chutarme toda una discusión sobre la genialidad del artista, porque en esa tradición se explica desde la psicología, o en el mejor de los casos desde la sociología, desde el privilegio, etcétera, el capital cultural, pero lo hice porque me forzaron, porque a mí, para los textos que yo trabajaba, eso no importa. La separación entre lo ético y lo estético no se ha dado en la tradición. Eso sea, que yo quería trabajar, eso se da en la tradición de la ilustración. Entonces, digamos que por ahí podría decir, ¿no? Pensar eh, que es universal ya es una pequeña, un lastre para intentar imaginar, porque o sea, como muchos historiadores han demostrado, eh, la cartografía solo se da con el colonialismo europeo, pero no los mapas, pues, sino la cartografía, una tradición de mapeo, eh, que, que, en el cual se inventa la idea de América, pero más que eso, los europeos se inventan la idea de los europeos, o sea, de ellos mismos. O sea, América para lo que se diseña es para que los europeos digan qué son ellos, y lo que son conquistadores, son los llevadores de la civilización, son salvadores de almas y son los dominadores del territorio, son los dominadores de la naturaleza, ¿no? Eh, por eso es que, claro, ciertos mapas son una agresión al territorio, son estas rayas que no tienen ningún sentido más que el decir, esto es Estados Unidos y esto es México. Y entonces vamos a ver el discurso nacional mexicano que va a decir, nos robaron nuestro territorio, pero ese territorio no era mexicano, ni siquiera lo conocían. Ese territorio era de los pueblos nómadas que estaban en ese lugar, los cuales estuvieron siendo agredidos primero por los españoles, luego por los ingleses, luego por México y luego por Estados Unidos, ¿no? O sea, la idea del territorio desconocido fue o sea, cuando México se independiza, y espero no estar divagando demasiado, lo que necesitan es crear la Sociedad Mexicana de Geografía para conocer el espacio que ellos dicen que es suyo, pero que no tienen ni la menor idea de qué cosa está sucediendo ahí, ¿no? Y podemos ir a la tradición estadounidense, y por eso me gusta tanto también Red Dead, porque es la conquista del oeste, ¿no? O sea, el discurso de Cortés, de decir aquí no había nada en las cartas, es exactamente el mismo para el avance de Estados Unidos hacia el oeste, pero no hablo de ese tiempo, hablo de los spaghetti westerns, pues de Sergio Leone, pues que a mí me gustan muchísimo. Es exactamente el mismo discurso. Eh, entonces, digamos, para salirnos de ese discurso, yo diría como lo más sencillo, a ver, para no divagar tanto, la lógica de esos mapas es establecer un dominio, y entonces como que a lo que más se recurre es a nombrar a las personas o a los héroes que dominaron ese lugar. Entonces los lugares se van a llamar Hudson, Washington, Nuevo León, etcétera. Por eso es que yo decía que no creo que sea tan necesario ser radicales ni crear nada nuevo, porque los otros tipos de mapas ya están ahí. En la tradición nuestra, por ejemplo, un lugar se va a llamar Añicats, ¿no? La Peña del Trueno, se va a llamar Taxucó, como el canal principal de agua. No vamos a tener en nuestra tradición ninguna estatua ni nombres de personas para las calles, porque no tiene absolutamente ningún sentido. Los mapeos tienen que ser en torno a la relación de nuestro pueblo con la tierra que somos nosotros mismos, por más esencialista que eso suene. Yo diría eso, pues, que para empezar la lógica de los topónimos, y hace rato Randy decía, los nombres, que parece poca cosa, a mí no me parece para nada poca cosa. Los nombres, y no lo estoy diciendo yo, la misma tradición en Oregon trae todo este discurso de volver a las toponimias originales, porque los nombres tienen muchísimo poder, ¿no? Entonces, como para aterrizar un poco, yo me alejaría de las búsquedas por lo nuevo y por lo radical, por una tradición mía y porque ahí está la manera de contravenirlo, pues, o sea, yo no sé si ya se perdió todo, pues, no sé si ya perdón, ya se arruinó el mundo, pero en todo caso, si hay discursos para contrarrestarlo, yo no creo que estén en la misma tradición que lo está destruyendo.
Thank you, both of you. And thank you, Mito, for bringing in those histories of power and conflict over epistemology that determine like maps. And I mean, I love the idea that in some sense, the most like radical or new thing we could do is go back and look at existing things in a new way. Because I do think it's not as if we're lacking in information. In some sense, it's about what gets surfaced and combined in new ways and what information gets used and deployed and by whom. So I would like to turn to some of the questions that
actually
we've received.
respond a little bit to that?
Randy, please. Yeah, I would love that.
I really like this idea that there's older traditions and existing traditions and maps that are as valuable as a potential radical future maps that Mito was talking about. And again, a lot of my historical knowledge of maps comes more from a European, Eurocentric viewpoint. But like some of the oldest maps are circular, even though there's debate about whether at that time people viewed the world as a sphere or circular, but the maps for some reason were circular, maybe because that's like how far you could walk. A lot of them were relational. They were like, oh, here, they're more like graphs, like, oh, if you walk to this town, then you can take a left and walk to this town. And they were less about the modern vision of maps, which is cartographic. And so at some point, as Mito said, all maps started, or at least Western thinking maps became cartographic. It represented the layout of the land in the correct scale. This idea that maps are supposed to show you the correct scale is not the original idea of maps. Originally, maps were to help you get from place to place with whatever information, or help you understand the relationships between places with whatever information could do that. It didn't have to be cartography into scale. So I like that answer very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that reminds me of the metro map here in DC and other metro maps, underground maps in different cities where like they're not to scale. They're not accurate to the territory, really. They're relational. They actually tell you just how to use the system. And they're usually overlaid on a kind of drawing of the city, but they're about knowing the relation of neighborhoods or sort of points of interest to one another. They're not about like actually understand, like looking at the metro map of DC will get you really lost if you try to use it to walk around. But it will give you a sense of how to just do one thing very well, which is figure out what train to get on. So, there's a question that kind of like relates to and builds on some of what we've been talking about. So maybe, we might just add a little bit to say. So it's from B. Bogart. And the question is, they're curious about the panelists' thoughts on the dependence of maps on boundaries. And they were saying, linking this to earlier discussions, and whether there's a possibility for maps without boundaries or fuzzy boundaries or even probabilistic boundaries. And this does remind me, Randy, of what you just said about the circular map, the map with that in some sense, it's not trying to say like, this is a representation of a whole space. It's like, here's a cutout, or here's like a
Mhm.
kind of a metaphor for a space. But I'd love to hear more about maps, perhaps without or rethinking boundaries.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is a related answer, but again, everyone knows you can't take a globe like the Earth and show the entirety of it on a rectangle. That does not, you can't wrap the Earth that way. And so there's been various solutions to solving this, and the most common one is Decatur projection, I think, is the one that we use. And that hugely distorts space. And so some parts, depending on where you center the planet, some parts are going to be they're going to appear much bigger than they really are, especially towards the poles, I believe is the way it is. And other parts are going to seem much smaller. So it distorts space, and it's another one of these decisions. But it was a way to handle the idea that, well, what happens if what is the boundary of the Earth? I think, Joey, your observation that a circular map helps with this is probably true, because a circle sort of suggests this is as far as we were willing to talk about it. And beyond that, either we didn't feel that we were able to provide information, or just didn't feel comfortable for some reason, and you can decide. So the rectangle has this very, left-brained, I got it all kind of mentality, again, this like male mentality of conquest. I understand it all. Like, I don't know why a rectangle does that, but I feel like it does. And other shapes might help. We talked a little bit in the Q&A, not the Q&A, but this panel before we started about, interplanetary humans, like the future where we go into space, and how you would handle that is a great question too. Like, what are, if we have a map that's of the solar system or the universe, how would we talk? Because, it seems unlikely that our species is ever going to find the boundaries of the universe through travel. So how would we talk about where we're no longer trying to provide a map?
Mito, would you like to respond to either building on Randy's comments or to this question about maps without
Sí.
boundaries or with fuzzy or probabilistic boundaries?
Sí, claro, y con el riesgo asumido de ser repetitivo, yo daría dos ejemplos. Eh, Uno que yo he descubierto recién, que es el de las tribus confederadas se me va un pueblo en Oregón, que a lo mejor ustedes tengan más claro, tribus confederadas del Gran Ronde en español, pues, ¿no? No sé. Ellos lo que hicieron fue, pues otra vez, no inventaron nada. Hay una discusión, sobre todo en Estados Unidos, sobre los mapas anticoloniales y los mapas decoloniales, me parece. Los unos plantean como que la discusión con la cartografía, etcétera, en sus propios términos. Y entonces discutes, pues, para la recuperación de los territorios, para combatir con la minería, para discutir en términos de la idea estatal del territorio, ¿no? Pero hay otros mapas que dicen en esa propuesta, que no es mía, por supuesto, que lo que hay que mapear son relaciones, y es exactamente lo que han dicho mis abuelos mucho tiempo. Esa es la lógica del mapeo entre nuestro pueblo. Entonces, lo que ellos hicieron fue, pues no tiene sentido como en imagen, más que para una persona que tenga la pertinencia cultural, y entonces se trata de los recorridos del verano y del invierno. Y entonces está escrito ahí como dónde están los lugares para abastecerse, dónde se esconde, dónde es mejor guarecerse de las nevadas, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, es texto, infiero, y no tiene como coordenadas, sino la llave para, la clave argumental para descifrar ese mapa tiene que ver con los relatos y con los ciclos temporales, ¿no? Y otra cosa que yo quería comentar un poco era cómo se hace o cómo se ha hecho en mi comunidad. Em, Estaba buscando a ver si pudiese mostrarles algo. Mm. Bueno, el relato fundacional de mi comunidad obviamente que las leyendas tienen varias variantes, ¿no? Esa es como una de sus características. Pero es como el relato desde un lugar que se llama Pod, que es el llano, es un lugar plano, que se cuenta que ahí estaba la comunidad, hacia Neishmbim, que es traducido sería algo como agua donde se refleja la imagen, una cosa así, como un espejo de agua. Se supone que en ese lugar los abuelos vieron reflejado Tashkov, que es donde ahora es el centro del pueblo. En ese lugar se daban niños rollizos porque en el anterior ya no se estaban dando los niños. Y entonces se hace el recorrido y ahí mismo se ve el reflejo de Añicats, que es la deidad del pueblo. Para mí ahí está un mapa y no, tiene otro sentido, pero que no es nuevo, porque Randy mismo decía que los mapas primeros tenían la idea del recorrido. Pues probablemente esto sea más universal que incluso la tradición que dice que es universal, ¿no? Y que más bien fue la imposición de una lógica a muchísimos pueblos. Otros nombres que yo podía irles dando y respondiendo a la pregunta en donde los límites son difusos, o sea, tiene más que ver con idea de parajes, espacios en donde los límites están sujetos siempre a negociación y a diálogo, ¿no? Por ejemplo, aquí tengo un listado, por ejemplo, Ha'af-am, lugar de constantes derrumbes, ¿no? Tiene que ver con una relación, con un peligro de pasar por ahí, otro se llama Paho, que, que traducido sería matanza con lanzas, y es la explicación de una leyenda también de la comunidad, de una pelea con la comunidad vecina, que por supuesto siempre gana quien cuenta la leyenda, y que por eso el pueblo nuestro ahora es más grande que la otra, ¿no? Eh, Hay otro que a mí me gusta mucho que se llama Podenpush y Poden, otra vez volviendo a esta idea, la lógica occidental dice que existen 4 estaciones, pero muchos de nosotros, de nuestros estudios, entre ellos Julio César, que mencioné hace rato, han mostrado que esto no tiene ningún sentido en muchas partes. Nosotros tenemos 3 estaciones, que es Poden, época de lluvias, tenemos secas y tenemos fríos. Esto de las hojas que se caen y la nievecita con que se pinta, jamás en la vida se ha visto por acá, ¿no? Y Push es como el florecimiento del maíz. Entonces es el florecimiento del maíz en la época de lluvias. Ese es el nombre del lugar. Y entonces, ¿como qué sentido tendría decir hasta aquí acaba el florecimiento y aquí ya empieza? No. Respondería pues que sí existen muchas tradiciones en donde los límites no tienen mayor sentido, pues, ¿no? Y pues solo ahí el apunte desde mi experiencia que olvidar, por eso es que es tan importante asesinar a los defensores del territorio, porque eliminando a las personas se eliminan estas otras lógicas, pues, ¿no? Que es un gran problema que tenemos actualmente en México y en muchos países. Eh, Quitarnos la lengua es quitarnos estas maneras de concebir al mundo y acomodarnos de la otra manera en que es imposible pensar alternativas. Y me parece que es una empresa que ha tenido muchísimo éxito.
Mhm. All right. Well, I would like to try to get to a couple more of these questions quickly. Thank you all for submitting questions and the two of you for being so game responding. One, I mean, I want to just give you a chance to bridge on, or you can just say, like, I've said all I need to say about this. That last question, we have another question from Igor Rodriguez, who asks, are there other culturally specific forms of mapping space that are not based on a bird's eye view or godly perspective? So Randy, you talked a little bit about this, and Mito, you were just talking about some alternative modes of mapping. And yeah, I wonder if there's any others that seem pertinent to bring up or that provide alternatives that people can kind of investigate further.
The ones I mentioned are the ones that come to mind. So there's some that are, an actual perspective drawing of a space that's, even if it's not real, is meant to represent a real view, not a God's view, an abstract high in the air, like a satellite view. The ones that are relational, like, oh, here's a town. They would often show sort of the towns from side view, like here's a castle, here's a little town, here's another little town, and just show straight roads between them. And again, it was like a little graph that shows you, oh, if you want to walk from this village to that village, here's how you would do it. And because they were not cartographically correct scale, they would sort of kind of crunch the whole thing in. So like Joey was saying about a subway map, the important thing was just like getting all of these nodes and the vertices, the connections between them, and less important, and so it would tell a story, as Mito keeps saying. It's like, oh, I start in this town and I look for the road to this town, and then I walk on that, and it'd say like 1.5 days, and then I've arrived in this town. And so that's not a God perspective. It's a kind of just a way to convey information, like a story about how to go from place to place.
Thank you. Mito, any other kinds of maps or traditions of map creation that you want to mention as alternatives to this bird's eye or God's eye view? All right. Well, let's actually move on to the next question then. So I will have a picture to show you. So this is from Ali Schriebman, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing people's names, but Ali says, I'd love to hear your thoughts about Joaquin Torres Garcia's America Invertida. And they shared an image. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. And, yeah. All right. Can everybody see this map here? I need to actually zoom out a little bit. My apologies. So I have heard of, I've seen these maps before where it's the, Randy, you mentioned the Mercator projection where it's flipped, right? And then it's recalibrated and the sizing's different. We see that, like, we've been given a view of the world that perhaps privileges some regions over others. But this is another map. It looks like it's just of South America specifically, and it's inverted, but there's also particular things included and left out, and the types of drawing that we talked about. So yeah, any reactions or thoughts to this map? Does it remind either of you or anything? Or
Sí, bueno, a mí una persona muy querida que ha sido una gran interlocutora me lo regaló. No sé si está en algún museo en Argentina. Desconozco como más allá de eso. Pensando en esto, volvería como esto sería como un ejemplo de estos mapas que intentan dialogar con esa tradición casi en sus mismos términos, ¿no? O sea, aquí vemos como la construcción del espacio más o menos desde la misma lógica, aunque invertida. En ese sentido, por ejemplo, los mapuches tienen una historia fortísima de discusión con el Estado chileno y con el Estado argentino, ¿no? Aquí mismo los Huirrari, nosotros mismos, los Mijes, pues la pelea con los caciques del istmo de Tehuantepec se da en ir a los archivos y encontrar los títulos primordiales. A mí me parece un gran ejercicio, sobre todo porque para discutir con los estados, en este caso con el Estado mexicano, forzosamente lo tenemos que hacer en sus términos, pues. Entonces lo que yo propongo, no por una ocurrencia, sino por una tradición a la que pertenezco, no va en ningún sentido en anular la necesidad de estos mapas y de que la gente como nosotros se forme en esas posturas, o que aprendamos a hacer nuestros propios videojuegos, ¿no? O que recibamos capacitaciones de programación y de todo lo que se necesita. Eso podría yo decir.
Randy, anything to add or share about this, or just the idea of inverting a map, or this particular artistic piece? It sounds like I actually didn't know this is more of a gallery piece. It makes sense given how it's composed.
I love that map, and it kind of reminded me of this one, which is another style of inverted map. In this case, it's this imagination exercise about what if the land was ocean and the ocean was land. But it preserves things like what the ocean ranges that are underneath the water are. And so therefore you can imagine, again, it's an imagination exercise of walking, from the North American Ocean to the African Ocean and having to cross the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is now a land-based mountain range. So something about that last map kind of reminded me of it. It's a way of thinking about things a little differently and being able to see them with fresh eyes.
So Randy, before I say goodbye, I want to just ask, since you made a game where you created a map of Mars and tried to give people an experience of traversing Mars, if we're imagining a human future where there's activity and exploration and perhaps some sort of dwelling on Mars, what do we need to be thinking about as we make maps? And you gestured toward this earlier, so you opened the door, where if we're creating a map for an interplanetary species, what is something that we need to keep in mind as a parting shot?
That's a big question. I don't think I have a great answer for it. I mean, I think the biggest thing I can think of is that Mars is a new space that, as far as we know, is not occupied by sentient creatures. And so it's a chance to approach a new space correctly, with a better moral compass than in the past Europeans have approached their way to find spaces that were already occupied and have a relationship with them. And as we've talked about, the maps are a tool for crafting how we as a society think about these spaces and how we relate to them. So I think there's no short answer, but just a massive degree of thoughtfulness would be very helpful.
Yeah, as I've approached this, it's just, a sense of preparing for this conversation, a sense of humility about Mars, and not like just saying, okay, we just need to create the same cartographical, colonial representations of Mars so we can like best understand where the resources are or something like that, that we actually need to think about our relation as Earthlings to this new planet and create maps of Mars and of Earth and Mars together that are taking lessons from this conversation, a bit more responsive to relationships and history and parsing the landscape and trying to appreciate what's there and not just kind of bulldoze over it. So thank you both so much for being here. Randy, Mito, I really appreciate your time. We're just about out of time. I just put a link in the chat to the Martian Encounters web pages in English and Espanol, in case you want to join us at 4 p.m. Central Mexico time. Today, we're going to have the final session hosted by my friend and colleague, Marcela Chow, on Martian weirdness, or a lo Marciano. And I'm actually hoping one of my collaborators can drop in the chat a link to learn more about workshops that we are holding concurrently with this series of virtual events in Mexico City. So there's in-person workshops delving into all of these topics. So I'm going to kind of like just hang for a second and see if somebody can drop in the information about those. Wonderful. Yes. So in chat, there's a Google Docs link that will give you some information about how to sign up for workshops. Those are in Mexico City. So if you're not near or in Mexico City, those are going to be hard to get to. But for those of you who are there, I hope you can join. And Randy and Mito, thank you. I regret that we didn't have Grace here with us, but I had such a wonderful time talking to the two of you. And thank you for being so generous with your insights and time.
Thank you, Joey.
All right. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Gracias.